And what we as DEI leaders, and indeed those who are allies to DEI, we have to always stand up for what's right. I have full of these old expressions, but one of the expressions I say is there is never a good time to compromise your values.
Hi everyone, Alejandro here, and welcome back to How to College First Gen. Since Black History Month is right around the corner, we want to take this month to highlight Black first generation students' undergraduate and professional journeys. Today, we invited Zafar Brooks, the Chief Diversity Officer at Infoblox. Zafar has spent 36 years in corporate America and 20 as a leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion, more commonly known as DE&I. He is a first generation student who will share his journey to becoming a leader in DE&I and talk about what it means to build a career in diversity, equity, and inclusion as a first generation student. Thank you for joining us so far.
Thank you, Alejandro, for having me. I'm excited about it.
Before we dive into today's topic, let's back up a little bit. Could you tell me a little bit about your background? Where did you grow up and where did you go to college?
Sure. Well, thank you so much. So I was raised in Memphis, Tennessee, the American South, and came of age in the late 1970s, went to college in the early 80s, and I went off to Fisk University, which is one of the nation's oldest historical black colleges. I think it's the third oldest in the country. Decided that I originally wanted to be an attorney and was studying to be a lawyer, and along the way had if you will, the bug to get involved in business and was actually recruited by IBM to do a summer internship. And that really opened my eyes. As you mentioned, that in my family, my father had come out of the military area, the Vietnam era, and had worked in baking as a baker. And my mom had done various roles and later became a school teacher. And so to the opportunity to go off to college and to stay in a dormitory and all those things, that was quite new for us at the time. I had one cousin actually who had done so and a year earlier. And so the excitement of going off to school, meeting new friends, learning about new experiences and new backgrounds and people who had done different things was all new and exciting. So once I got to IBM and participated in a summer program, an internship program with them that they had at the time identified diverse talent, diverse students to introduce them to careers in, of all things, ironically, technology. It really opened my eyes to perhaps new options and new opportunities, and that led me to a career actually at the time at Ford Motor Company, and spent 35 wonderful years in the automotive industry doing a myriad of different things.
And it sounds like attending Fisk University and HBCU was a really pivotal moment in your life that affected your career beyond. Could you tell me a little bit about what your undergraduate experience was like attending an HBCU?
Yeah, it was. Fisk University literally changed my life in ways that I could not have even imagined. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and the era that I grew up in had sort of the unfortunate experience of being the place where Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. That happened to be the year that I was about to head off to kindergarten. So my formative years in school were in a community that had been really divided along racial issues, and certainly with the assassination of Dr. King, the community was very raw. And so in those sort of days where you're going to be in a kindergarten or a first, second, third grader and you're learning your alphabet and you're meeting people, you also are understanding, although you don't appreciate because you're too young, you understand that this environment you're in, there's something that's just not quite right. I have a 5-year-old grandson, and he's very aware when something doesn't quite work or when something is a bit off. And so I was sort of that 5 or 6-year-old in those late 60, early 70 periods where you could sense that something wasn't quite right. Well, after I got my high school diploma, I wanted to really sort of get my collegiate education, and going to a historical black college as an African American, it meant something to me. Understanding more about the culture, understanding more about sort of the contributions that African Americans and indeed blacks around the world have contributed, learning about art and literature, meeting different people who had different lived experiences than I had. And it was just eye opening. The professors that were there, Fisk is a relatively small school, about 1,500 or so kids, so it was not uncommon to have a class with 6, 8 people in the class, and a professor who may have worked 30 years at NASA, who was now teaching you a specific element of engineering or mathematics, or a writer who may have actually written with somebody or known somebody like Langston Hughes or Claude McKay. A famous Fisk alumni is Nikki Giovanni, the famous poet. So, that era, the early 1980s at Fisk, was really an amazing time, historically speaking, where we got to meet so many wonderful people, and they exposed me to new ideas, new concepts, and things that I just didn't know were possible for people who look like me. And that led me, as I said, on to ultimately getting into corporate America and following a corporate career.
So before entering corporate America, I can imagine the excitement of even going to a 4-year university. Being the first in your family to walk across that stage after those 4 years is an extremely thrilling moment, not just for yourself, but also for the people who came before you. Could you talk a little bit about what it felt like to walk across that stage?
Wow, that's a really great question, and it's one of those sort of fond memories you have that sit in the recesses of your mind that shape you in so many ways. Well, when I think about that May Day in 1986, and I look across the aisle, I hadn't thought about this in a long time, but my grandmother was there, and my grandmother meant a lot to me. She was the granddaughter of slaves herself. My grandfather long since passed away, but had not been there. And to see my father and to see my mother and to see cousins and uncles and aunts, and the hope that was in their eyes about what had been achieved. To be clear, I had family members who had attended college and even had a couple of family members who had gotten degrees. But the notion of going away to college and living on a dorm and spending 4 years and getting a diploma, that being your full-time effort and not working and going to school part-time at nights and things like that, that just had not been done. I had one other cousin, Linda, who had graduated the year before. But what that meant for our family, and to think about my grandfather, who was born in 1884, and he was the grandson of a slave, and he was a sharecropper himself. And my grandmother, who was born in 1906 and was born before, women had the right to vote, and born in the segregated South, and what was happening in that era for Black people, and the absence there too for the things that they were able to do. The most basic things, the public accommodations laws that hadn't been passed yet for, the decency of using public facilities or getting jobs, or, even in the military, being respected for who you were as a people. And I just remember sort of the weight of all of that as I was coming across the stage, that we had sort of entered this new space. I had gotten to study with the likes of Dr. L.M. Collins, who was a contemporary of Dr. Du Bois, who knew Dr. Du Bois, I should say, and who knew people like County Cullen and Claude McKay and Langston Hughes. And just to realize that this dream fulfilled, if my grandfather could have lived to have seen that day, it would have been a day that I think that he was a man of faith, a religious man. It was a day that he prayed for his own children, that he didn't get to realize. He came of age during an era of lynching, in the segregated South. And there was a story in the family once how he had to leave a community for fear of losing his own life, because he happened to be someone who stood up against discrimination and against wrongdoing. Or to watch my grandmother, who was part Native American, and had to address the injustices. She was a very fair-skinned woman, but who never not identified as Black. And then my own mother and her journey to going from that experience to getting a career in education. It was just a very proud moment for my family, a proud moment for me. But I understood the significance. I understood the gravity of the moment. I understood who I was and what I represented. And since then, I'm very proud. I've got two brothers and one sister, and both my brothers went on. Actually, my sister and both my brothers all went on to law school and are doing different things in the law these days. And I've got cousins now who are doctors, and cousins who are in business and own their own companies. But I think that was a moment that began to change what was possible and to be the person to be at that sort of that intersection, if you will, as a family that says through education there are other options to us and new possibilities. The gravity of that moment I was grateful for. I recognize that I'm blessed, and I recognize that a lot of people contributed so that I could have that moment. And today, I'm very honored that that moment meant so much to my family and my grandmother. She's passed away maybe 20 years now, but that moment, I have that picture. I still have that picture with she and I on the lawn of Fisk University, to understand that this was not even an idea that she could have conceived of in the 19 teens. My grandfather could never have conceived of this moment. To see their grandson fulfill those those dreams, yeah, that was a pretty good day.
It sounds like walking across that stage, you realize that this moment isn't just your own. This is a moment for your parents. This is a moment for your predecessors, your ancestors, who worked tirelessly to making sure that you had these opportunities, not just for yourself, but for future generations beyond. And that's a really big responsibility to hold. I felt the same way whenever I graduated from college a couple of years ago and I saw my parents' faces. And I think that was a really humbling moment for me because it made me realize that a lot of first generation college students, we really are our parents' wildest dreams. We're our ancestors' wildest dreams. And it's really special to see them share this moment with you.
Yeah, indeed, there is an old expression that goes to "he much is given, much is expected." And when you think about the immigrant experience, to be sure, being undocumented, and if you sort of juxtapose that to the segregated South, being an American citizen in your own country, but understanding that there were spaces and places that were not available to you, and that at risk of life, frankly, for daring to challenge that, to watch my own mother and my own father come of age before the Voting Rights Act, but to be out, protesting and marching so that those privileges would would come about, and understanding that it may not happen for them. It just may not be. They may not be the ones who were the direct beneficiaries, but they understood instinctively the impact of what this could be for their families. And so now, of course, I was able to get my degree and move on. And so my children didn't see that as an option that was not on the table for them. And my grandchild now comes of age in an era where that's just a part of who we are, and our family and who we are. So yeah, there is a gravity of that moment that really does grab you. And for those who have graduated, we respect everyone who had an opportunity to go on. It is an accomplishment in and of its own right. But for those who came of age, or who had to come amongst the challenges that were also occurring environmentally, that moment, the gravity of that moment, does not get lost on you.
For a lot of first generation students, entering the professional world can be a very daunting experience. I know it was for me whenever I graduated college, trying to figure out what was my next move and who I could ask advice to. Both of my parents are blue collar workers. My mom has been cleaning houses for more than 10 years, and my dad works at an industrial soap making factory. So it's difficult to ask them for career advice, not only because I'm a first generation college graduate, but I'm also a first generation professional. I'm figuring this out on my own from the ground up. Could you talk a little bit about what it was like entering your first professional job out of college? And how did you decide to start your career there?
So, as you were sharing the story about your family and their experiences, my father baked bread at Kroger Bakery for the better part of 40 years. My mother was a public school teacher, and she worked in the inner city schools in the city of Memphis. At the time she got into schools, that was the only option available to her. And they had no experience in corporate America. They had no advice to offer me about what I would expect in corporate America. I uh, I tease and share. I have shared this story before. The day of my very first day on the job, I went to Ford Motor Company in Omaha, Nebraska, and someone came to shake my hand. shaking hands was not a concept that we did in undergrad. It just, that concept didn't exist. We knew how to shake hands, but just the idea of a handshake as a part of the business ethos was just not something that I was familiar with. And so I was reminded that I was sort of an other, if you will, in the corporate context, and I had to learn the language. I had to learn the sort of the way things were done. This predates laptops and cell phones, so I couldn't Google anything. So there was a lot of trial and error. Giving public presentations. In our community, the space that often you learn was at the church, and that's where you learn to present yourself, or to speak, or to be in a club within the church, or to be in an auxiliary, and that was very defining for who you were. And then, of course, at an institution like Fisk, where you had the nurture and the care, where the professors would give you that experience. But yeah, it was not something that was innate. It wasn't something that you just sort of knew. There was some trial, there was some error. I'm glad that video doesn't exist from that era. I'm glad there weren't social media from that era, because I suspect some of the things I did in those early days, from doing my presentations to developing my ideas, and to how I conveyed them or how I communicated them, probably wasn't exactly the way others had done it. I had to come to it. And fortunately, I had some great mentors, some great supporters, some great advisors who trusted me and gave me the opportunity to learn, but also stayed with me in the space of failure. Failure is a part of the business equation and is necessary, because once one fails, one learns a little bit about it. You learn the edges of whatever is possible in that idea, and it allows you to course correct. I had an old supervisor who was very much an inspirational leader in my career. And he said, the answer is never no. It's just no for now. And so what you learn over the course of time is how to get to yes, or how to change whatever you needed to change to affect the outcome you chose. But that the moral of ultimately what this guy's name was Leo, ultimately what Leo was saying is, you don't give up just because you may have a setback. You learn from the setback, you evolve, and then you push through to the next step of whatever it is you're trying to achieve.
So you have a lifetime worth of experience working in DE&I. When did you decide to make the transition to a career in diversity, equity, and inclusion? What role did you have in DE&I, and why is this work meaningful to you?
Yes, I feel like it dates me. 36 years is a lifetime in a career, to be sure. Having gotten into corporate America, 35 years actually, in 1986, and about 17, just about half of that was leading DEI. For me, in the earliest stages of my career, having grown up again in Tennessee, and this was one of the values that my mother always pressed through my family, my siblings and I. And she always said, wherever you go in life, try to help somebody else. Remember, somebody helped you along the journey. So try to help somebody else. So I guess you might say that I was attracted very, very early in my career. In the earliest days, I was the chair of something called the EI Committee, Employee Involvement. That was a precursor to ERGs in the mid 80s. But it was this idea that there were those who were underrepresented, underserved, whose voices were maybe not as loud or as often sought as others. And I was a bit of a champion for that. I wanted to be able to sort of to be a vessel for those conversations to occur. And so somewhere in the 90s or so, I got involved in various employee committees and activities and representing the voices of different employees in the organization. This again is in an era where, we weren't still well represented, particularly in the auto space. I mean, it was in the 90s that we were still sorely underrepresented by women in the workplace. And so you would not be uncommon to be in meetings where there was one or fewer women that had a voice at the table. And, I always sort of said women have been 50% of population since the beginning of time, and certainly represented the vast majority of the purchase decisions, purchase intent, 60, 70% of purchase intent. And so the absence of women voices certainly did not benefit our organization. We would be better when more voices are heard. So I would try to be a spokesperson in that regard. And then I got a chance to actually lead a diversity department of my own. And that then was a key opportunity for me to connect the business case of DEI to the business. I've always said diversity is the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do for a lot of reasons. It also is good for business. It's an and, not an or. It's the right thing to do, and it's good for business. The marketplace is reflected by different voices and different ideas and different lived experiences. It helps us with creativity. It helps us with innovation. It helps us with understanding our consumers. It helps us in identifying talent that has a lot to offer, and it certainly helps us in our business process in developing the best business ideas when we have diverse ideas at the table. Somebody once said, we never knew how good baseball could be till everyone was allowed to play. And so being sort of having grown up with that voice in my head where my mother said, don't forget someone helped you along the way. And then understanding that oftentimes diverse voices are less heard in the enterprise, and then having an opportunity to lead a diversity organization that connect diversity to the overall business goals of the organization really was a full circle moment for me, going all the way back to those early days of having left high school to go off to college at a Black college and understanding who we were and what our voices were and how to convey our voice in the workplace, and then being able to then ultimately, toward the sort of twilight of my career, being able to lead a global organization in that same regard has been an amazing journey that I couldn't have imagined all those many years ago.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't a major that you could pursue in your undergraduate studies, so it can be a little bit difficult kind of breaking into this industry. As you were building out your career in diversity, equity, and inclusion, did you have any mentors that helped you guide you along the way?
Yeah, you're right. Well, there are careers that one can do in various activities that are that do have a diversity sort of connection to them. But the title or the degree of diversity, equity, inclusion, I'm not aware that title exists. There's all kinds of programs in women's studies and urban studies and working with populations and so forth and so on, organizational behavior and HR. I had a lot of leaders, a lot of mentors who trusted me very early on in my career, who believed in me. In fact, the very first person I ever worked for was a fellow named Jim Ludlow, and he was at Ford Motor Company, since you mentioned Ford. And one of the things that Jim said to me is that he was excited to have me at the organization, and he was really excited about my contributions. And he was unapologetic about the fact that he welcomed the fact that I was a diverse person at the organization. Now, I was the only person of color in that office at the time, certainly the only person of color in the sales force, and that my boss was really signaling to me very early on how he valued this this commitment to diversity and this diversity of thought that I could bring to his organization. And I felt welcomed, and I felt that through that I could bring my whole self to work, and that he understood that I had a contribution to make, even though my contribution might have looked differently and come from a different lived experience. Further, as I got on in my career, I met some wonderful people, one of whom I continue to be connected to today, Jim Gwaldy, who himself was an executive at the company. This again was at Ford the earliest days, and was someone who sort of inspired me to start thinking like a leader, start thinking bigger about what my capacity was and what my potential was and what I could do. For me, I was just me. I was just doing the work I was doing. But someone who believed that I had more to offer and that my voice could change and shape others was like, wow. And then later I went on to work for another fellow who inspired me to think that I actually could make a meaningful impact. And today I have the great fortune of working for a woman named Carolyn Gracie in my current company as Chief Human Resources Officer. And every day, Carolyn is excited about what we do and motivates us to do more and try things, and is okay with things that don't look like the past or aren't something we always did before. And we are innovating and we are trying. And she is one who often says she's a learner. So she's open to new ideas, to be to be taught or to learn or to participate in something new. So, having allies, having support systems, having folks who trust you, and importantly, those who maybe don't agree with you, allows you to sharpen your thinking, sharpen your ideas. Because for you, your ideas are good, and you know what your ideas are, and you're committed to them. But you also need to understand that you have to go to the marketplace to bring that idea forward, and so you have to learn how to compete for the whatever that resource is: time, money, talent, people, to get your idea implemented. Because a great idea without implementation is just a dream, and we got to bring that dream forward. We need dreams. Dreams shape what we can do. They take us outside the four corners of what's possible today and force us to keep looking in the future. But we have to be able to convert that sort of dream, that notion, into practice. And having leaders like Carolyn, for me today, are so important, and our CEO, Jesper, are so important, lest these ideas don't get executed.
I want to touch on something that you said about having people in the room who don't agree with you. Was there a time where your work in DE&I was not accepted or celebrated in corporate America? And how did you navigate that?
Diversity, equity, inclusion is at the end of the day about culture change. It really is about culture. And it's also about bringing both the organization's commitment to its core values to its business practices. Just because an organization hires certain people that meet certain criteria in the hiring process does not mean whatever the baggage that that person brings in the outside world will stop at the water's edge of the company. I always say, sort of, if a person didn't like pets before they joined the company, just because the company somehow welcomed people to bring their pets to work, didn't mean that we're going to change that for that person. I mean, it's certainly a simple analogy in that regard. So what I have learned is, yeah, you're going to meet people along the way who are not committed to whatever the idea is that you are sharing. That is not unique to diversity. It is just a part of the business process that you're bringing different people together who have different ideas, and sometimes those ideas are not shared. What we as DEI leaders have to do is, I always sort of say, go back to your core values. Who are you as an organization, and what is it as an organization you espouse to do? And that I could not think of a single example in any business model where diversity can't make it better. I can't think of an idea where diversity can't make it better. To bring new thinking affords you access to innovation. To have top talent, if you only are sort of recruiting for certain sort of person's experiences, without those lived experiences, you can't, innovate. You can't make the process any better. Having diverse supply chains, give you access to sometimes lower costs, because they may oftentimes come from smaller enterprises with lower cost structures, and that they will bring lower cost to you. But the challenge to that all is that there are sort of the norms, the traditions, the way things were done, the sort of the club, if you like, of the way it just always was. And what we as DEI leaders, and indeed those who are allies to DEI, we have to always stand up for what's right. I have full of these old expressions, but one of the expressions I say is, there is never a good time to compromise your values. And if we value differences of thought, if we value having the best people, and that means reflecting the communities in which we work and do business, and creating a space where people can bring their whole selves to work, if they're LGBTQAI, or if they are females, or if they're from different cultures, or they speak different languages, when they feel comfortable in the workplace, the research overwhelmingly, compellingly says they're going to perform greater. And that performance will accrue to the benefit of the organization in achieving its overall business goals as well. So yes, you're going to have naysayers. You're going to have folks who aren't per se identified with some of the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion. Our role is to not compromise our values, to make clear what we're doing and why we're doing it, and how it fits within the overall business model, and to be a space where perhaps there is genuinely there's a gap of understanding, there's a gap of knowledge, and that sometimes what may happen is those people will learn something new that they didn't know before, and through that experience they grow, and their growth can contribute to the growth of the company. And sadly, sometimes people can't get there, and if they can't get there, as I said in the beginning, there's not a time to compromise on the values. It may be it may be a wake up call for that individual, that this organization and its values, if they don't align with that organization, with that individual, then just maybe, then maybe they need to perhaps move on. And the data show that as well. It's unfortunate, but the reality is we will have some who may not get there. And if they don't get there, then as an organization, we also have to help them find a place that's right for them, because we shouldn't compromise our own values as an organization.
Some might consider you a veteran of D&I. You've seen this industry change and grow over recent decades, and especially after the murder of George Floyd, corporations worldwide had a wake up call to address systemic injustice within and beyond their industries. How have you seen this field evolve, and where do you see it going? What are some of the obstacles in the profession?
The summer of 2020 was, I think, will go down in history as a defining moment in the United States, and indeed perhaps globally. Not only did COVID 19 cause a sort of a reckoning and a sort of a re understanding our own frailty as humans, but with the unfortunate and tragic murder of Mr. George Floyd in Minneapolis, it reminded us all that we still had some work to do. Not everyone's experiences uh, were equally enjoyed. As a black man myself, and witnessing sadly that 9 minutes or so of a tape of Mr. Floyd, I could identify that could have been me. That could have easily been. I have a son who's 31. It could have is easily been my own son in his pain through what he experienced, and that so often that we find ways to divide ourselves. Like, surely the color of his skin led to the suspicion that perhaps he could have done something wrong. The benefit of the doubt didn't exist for him on that day. Through a lot of pain, sometimes we evolve, we grow, and we learn. And if there was a moment that Mr. Floyd's tragic murder afforded us, it afforded us a moment, a space, a time to reflect as a society on the real lived experiences that some parts of this society face. That justice was not colorblind. That there were those who experienced life in a very different way. And one of the maybe moments in my life that I was very pleased with is that corporate America, quite broadly, stepped up to the moment and had an introspective moment and began to assess the things perhaps it had taken for granted within the offices and boardrooms and policies and practices and procedures of so many companies around, including our very own. And those moments began to challenge the suppositions that had just been held, that somehow that, since we don't have some of the vestiges, the artifacts of a past era, the signs, the water fountains only, or where people couldn't apply for the work, or the words that were used, or the epithets that were called, that somehow that we had transcended, or we had a black president, so we must be okay. But I think that moment caused us all to step back, caused us all to take a real hard look and look around the table, much like I described in those early 80s when we looked around the table to see who was sitting at the table and what our practices were, and did it align with what we said were our stated values. And we began to make change. My grandmother, God rest her soul, always had a statement, a saying that I've kept with me all my life. And she said, and it was really a statement about hope. And she said, I believe that today will be better than yesterday, and tomorrow will be better than today. I believe that today will be better than yesterday, and tomorrow will be better than today. And I think that came from her era of having hope. We believed that things can get better, that we have to keep moving forward. We really don't have an option of giving up. It is in all of our shared interests when we can find ways to bring us together. We can find ways to resolve our problems. We can find ways to coexist. This is one planet. We're one community of humans. And if we are to coexist, if we are to get along, if we are to grow, we need each other. And I think what Mr. Floyd's moment reminded us is that as a society, as a community, that we may have taken for granted the connection we have and our association one to another. And so, yes, I'm hopeful that tomorrow will be better than today. I'm hopeful that the legacy that Mr. Floyd left us all is one that reminds us that we can't take things for granted, that we can't assume things are what they are, that we have a duty, indeed, an obligation to continue to test our assumptions, to continue to test our processes, to look for ways to bring us together, to ensure that voices are heard. We assume that sometimes we hear voices, but we don't know if those voices are heard by all equitably. That's the E in DEI, and that just because something isn't overt doesn't mean it's not happening, that it's real. And so, yes, it was a moment that so many CEOs stepped up, so many others stepped up and began to reflect. Now, our opportunity is, let's not let this moment pass. Let's not lose what this moment was at the altar of expedience or convenience. Let's remind ourselves that it has always been so. My friend Bernice King, Dr. King's daughter, said one time at a speech I heard her say that it is the obligation of every generation to preserve the gains of the generation to pass for the generation to come. We are our brothers and sisters keepers, and we have a duty to ensure that each generation to come realizes the potential, its potential, and that we protect the gains that we've already achieved. Lest we not, then we are, as her father said, subject to chaos or community, and we would like to choose community in the course of that journey. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but it's an important inflection in our society that those of us who didn't come of age in the early part of the civil rights movement, or before that, in the earliest movements in our society, we were tested. And that test is one that history will still yet define. But it was inspiring to know that people of goodwill stood up and decided this is a moment. And in this moment, we will be defined as what our values say we intend to represent.
I really appreciate you mentioning that quote about protecting the gains of past generations. It's very indicative of the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's important to note that this work isn't over whenever we have representation by numbers or some other measurement. This work is ongoing because there's always more room to create a culture that is more diverse, equitable, and inclusive.
Well, to coin a phrase, when you know better, you do better. And there may have been times as a society, as a people, there were things we did not understand and we didn't know. We assumed that were happening. The immigrant experience in America. A lot of people remember Brown versus Board of Education, which was a seminal moment in education in the 1950s that afforded at least the desegregation of classrooms. But what a lot of people didn't know is that that case originally started with the Mendoza case in California, where a group of migrant workers or parents were fighting for similar educations for their own children as well. So again, understanding one's history, understanding that place in history and space and its ability to have shaped a people is important. But when we understand more, and then we understand what those people's experiences are, then I believe I just have a natural sort of sense of, I believe in the betterment of people and the betterment of humankind, then we'll do better when we understand the mistakes we've made.
My last question for you is, what advice would you give first generation students aspiring to pursue a career in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, the first advice I'd say to first generation students who presumably we're talking about that are in the collegiate level and perhaps are about to graduate is I'd congratulate you for your own accomplishments. Your accomplishments are significant. And the gravity of that moment, of what you have achieved, and understanding that many people are watching, many people are watching and are rooting you on for success. So to honor that moment, to understand where you are in that moment. If you are so led to a career in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I recommend a few things. First is become a student of this space. Understand what this space is. I sometimes say when I'm giving talks on diversity, particularly at the collegiate level, is I say people don't see diversity until they don't see themselves. So if you're in a room full of women and you happen to be a woman, and the issue of what's going on in terms of something else may not immediately identify with you. What I mean by that is make sure you step outside your own comfort level. If you're Latino and you're thinking about Latino issues, that's awesome, and solve those. But understand the interconnectivity to Latino issues, to maybe LGBTQ issues as well. If you're Black and there are issues that are involving the Black community, connect with those who are not Black and understand their perspectives, because in that sort of the idea that if you're going to solve any problem, you need to understand both sides of the argument. Any good lawyer wants to understand the opposition's case as well as her own case. So understand where others are coming from to the best you can. That doesn't mean you have to believe what they believe, but at least understand what has led to their ideas. Get different resources. Try to look at other resources. I read a lot of things, and I read from people who I agree with and people who I don't agree with. I subscribe to a lot of newsletters so that it helps me evolve my thinking. Sort of get out of the echo chamber. Remember, I said you don't see diversity until you don't see yourself. If you're only in your echo chamber, that's what you're hearing, that's what you're seeing. Give yourself permission to hear the other side of the argument, and it will help shape your argument, frankly, when you're going forward. And it also may give you pause on things you assume you knew. Find an organization that aligns with your values. Oftentimes, go straight to the websites. And whatever they say they are is one thing, but what they do is another thing. So go to the websites, go to their social media pages, talk to folks who have had experience with the organizations. Do they align with what they say? We won't always get it right. We're going to miss it sometimes. We're going to say the wrong thing one day. We're going to do the wrong thing. We're going to sponsor the wrong organization. That's to be expected. Failure happens. Mistakes happen. But what do they do once they made the mistake? Did they learn from it? Did they evolve? And if they learned and if they evolved from it, that's instructive as well. So check their websites out. Check out who they are as well. And be unequivocal. There is never a good time to compromise your values. If you see something that generally doesn't feel right or look right to you about what an organization is saying or doing, ask the questions, test the system, see what the system says. If the system says that's just the way we do it around here, or if the system says, oh, you're too thin-skinned, or the system says, oh, you're making much ado about nothing, it may not be the right organization for you. So, diversity, equity, and inclusion is about culture change. It is about understanding how we can connect the organization's values and resources and principles to reflect the population writ large. And how does one do that? We all have different ways to approach that. Not all companies are going to be big consumer companies where people are going to be in line to buy the burgers or sodas or sneakers or whatever that is. And there are going to be other companies that do other things. But how does that companies present itself to the marketplace, and are they connected to their values? And then finally, what I would say is be comfortable with who you are. If you are a gay man, if you are a Asian woman who is first generation, if you are living in a different community or a country, if you're the first and only person of color at that organization, be comfortable in how you got there. You know, your experience, your contribution. You don't have to be the other. You don't have to change to be like them. I talked earlier about how I learned things in corporate America and how I evolved when I understood some of the practices of corporate America, but I never forgot who I was. I am a proud black man with for me, a rich family who believed in me, who trusted me, and a lot of others, black and none, who invested in me. And I never lost sight of that. I never lost sight of that. And I never didn't want to be that. And I wanted to be able to help others along the way. So ask yourself, why are you interested in this space of diversity, equity, inclusion? To be sure, to address the issues of underrepresentation is one aspect of it, but there's another aspect of it as well. And that aspect, well, maybe to help others evolve and learn and your business to achieve its highest potential. Because what we know is when we are all included, we are stronger. And together we can achieve our best selves. So that's what I would offer anyone who's coming into that space.
Zafar, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your honesty and your vulnerability, sharing your journey with us, and to see where you're at right now. You dropped so many gems that I'm sure our audience will have huge takeaways from. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Alejandro. I really appreciate you. I've learned a lot from you. You're an amazing young professional, and your future is so bright, and your star is so bright that you will shine and you will offer light and inspire others to go forward. So I applaud you on your forward thinkingness that this topic was something that would be of interest to others. So many congratulations to you, sir, and best wishes in everything you're doing as well.